Welcome once again to our series on elementary logic. In our last lecture, I explained that although typically arguments are presented in such a way that the premises are stated first, followed by the conclusion, I also observed that sometimes, maybe for stylistic reasons, arguments are formulated in such a way that the conclusion is stated either first or is placed in between the premises of the argument. And we also said there are words and there are expressions that indicate the presence of premises and conclusions of arguments. Today, we are going to take our discussions further by looking at deductive and inductive arguments. One can say that, generally speaking, arguments in logic can be classified into two broad categories, namely deductive arguments and inductive arguments. Now, according to traditional, or what you might call Aristotelian logic, a deductive argument is an argument that begins with a universal or general proposition as premise or premises and ends with a particular proposition as conclusion. Now, what do we mean by universal or general proposition? Typically, a universal or general proposition is formulated like all S is P, where S represents the subject of the proposition and P the predicate of the proposition. It can also be formulated as every S is a P. No S is a P. None but S is a P. Only S's are P's. Once you have any general statement, whether it is affirmative or negative, you call it a universal proposition. A typical deductive argument you can find in any elementary text book of logic is this: all humans are mortal. Obi is human. I didn't want to use the name Socrates. I want to make it a homegrown discussion. All humans are mortal. Obi is human. Therefore, Obi is mortal, or Obi is a mortal. That's a very typical deductive argument. You can see that it began with a universal or general proposition, all humans are mortal, and ended with a particular conclusion, Obi is mortal, or Obi is immortal. In the same vein, the traditional Aristotelian logician will tell you that an inductive argument is one that begins with a particular propositions as premises, and then concludes with a general or universal proposition. For example, you can say that Obi is Igbo and hardworking. Ada is Igbo and hardworking. Emeka is Igbo and hardworking. Kalu is Igbo and hardworking. Ifoma is Igbo and hardworking. Therefore, probably all Ndi Igbo are hardworking. That's a typical inductive argument. See, this is for illustrative purposes. As I was saying, the illustration I just gave about inductive argument is intended to show the structure of a typical inductive argument as one that flows from particular propositions as premises to universal or general conclusion to conclude the argument. So you can see that individual names were mentioned and we concluded by saying probably all Ndi Igbo are hardworking. Clearly, there are many deductive and inductive arguments that conform to the traditional Aristotelian paradigm. There are many. If you open any textbook on logic, you will see that. Not only logic, every other textbook where you have arguments, you can see that those that contain deductive arguments, many of them will follow the Aristotelian formula. The same with inductive arguments. However, logicians also recognize that there are genuinely deductive and inductive arguments that do not conform to the traditional or Aristotelian pattern. Take, for example, this deductive argument. All elements are made up of atoms. All atoms are made up of subatomic particles. Therefore, all elements are made up of subatomic particles. You can see from this second illustration that this is a typical, this is a genuine deductive argument. It's genuine. But it begins from general propositions as premises and ends with general proposition as conclusion, which means it does not conform to the traditional pattern for deductive arguments. Another one is a bachelor is an unmarried man. Kingsley is a bachelor. Therefore, Kingsley is an unmarried man. This is a correct deductive argument, but it contains particular propositions as premises and conclusion, meaning that it does not conform to the traditional definition of deductive arguments. The same reasoning applies when we consider inductive arguments. In other words, there are inductive arguments that contain general propositions throughout, and there are inductive arguments that contain particular propositions as premises and conclusion. Take, for example, all pastors are powerful and arrogant. All generals are powerful and arrogant. All ministers are powerful and arrogant. Therefore, probably all powerful people are arrogant. This illustration shows that we can have a genuinely inductive argument that contains general propositions as premises and conclusion. On the other hand, consider this argument. Alex Iwobi, a foreign-based Nigerian footballer, is wealthy. Victor Osimhen, a foreign-based Nigerian footballer, is wealthy. Kelechi Iheanacho, a foreign-based Nigerian footballer, is wealthy. Ahmed Musa is a foreign-based Nigerian footballer. Therefore, probably Ahmed Musa is wealthy. This is a typical inductive argument comprising particular propositions as premises and particular proposition as conclusion. You would have noticed that in our formulation of inductive arguments, the word probability is inserted, and I will explain why in a moment. But what we have said so far shows that we cannot fully rely on the traditional or Aristotelian definition of deductive and inductive arguments, simply because we have arguments that do not follow the pattern prescribed in traditional logic. So, modern logicians have come up with an idea of how to differentiate in a more effective manner deductive from inductive arguments. And they say that in order to differentiate or in order to determine whether an argument is deductive or inductive, the critical thing to do is to examine the relationship affirmed in the argument between the premises and the conclusion. In other words, what kind of support does the argument purport to the premises for the conclusion? In other words, if you have an argument and you want to find out whether it is deductive or inductive, the important thing to do is to examine the kind of support that the premises of the argument provide for the conclusion. In a deductive argument, the relationship between the premises and conclusion is so tight, is so strict, is so rigorous that the premises purport to provide conclusive grounds for the conclusion. Which means that if you accept the premises of a deductive argument, particularly if it is a valid deductive argument, then you have to accept the conclusion because the premises provide conclusive grounds for the conclusion. For instance, you cannot say, I agree that all humans are mortal and Obi is human, but I'm not sure that Obi is mortal. You can't. Once you argue that way, you are no longer logical. You are no longer logical because the argument about Obi, humans, and mortal is a valid deductive argument. And the moment you accept the premises, you are bound logically to accept the conclusion. So the premises of a deductive argument provide conclusive grounds for the conclusion. Whereas the premises of an inductive argument provide some support, but not conclusive ground for the conclusion. So you can see why all the arguments, inductive arguments, I formulated in this discussion, I used the word probable, probability, probably. That is to show that yes, the premises provide some support, but the support is not conclusive. So that for any of those inductive arguments I've formulated, you can still accept the premises and reject the conclusion. If you reason thoroughly for each and every of those inductive arguments, you will see that there is nothing illogical in accepting the premises but rejecting the conclusion. Therefore, the main takeaway in our analysis of deductive and deductive argument is this. Yes, there are innumerable deductive and inductive arguments that conform to the Aristotelian pattern. However, there are also innumerable others that do not. The critical thing, the critical point, the core thing to note is that the premises of a deductive argument provides conclusive ground for the conclusion. That is the claim in that argument. Whereas the premises of an inductive argument merely provide some support, but not conclusive grounds for its conclusion. So it is important for the student of logic to be aware, so that if you are asked, how can one differentiate a deductive argument from an inductive argument? You can give two answers. One, an answer that reflects the traditional Aristotelian conception, and then the answer that also brings in the perspective from modern logic. And the perspective from modern logic, for several reasons, are preferable to logicians than the Aristotelian criteria for differentiating between deductive and inductive arguments. Now, let us now move to the next topic, which has to do with truth, validity, and form. These are very important topics in logic, and every student of logic should endeavor to understand these concepts, and as a matter of fact, understudy the connections between them. Truth, validity, and form. Of the three concepts, truth is the most fundamental, philosophically speaking, because one of the most important motivations for the study of logic is to find ways of enabling us to move from true premises to true conclusions, so that truth can be osmotically, if I may use that biological term, conveyed from the premises to the conclusion. So that it is important that the student of logic should understand that one of the principal motivations why logicians spend a lot of intellectual energy investigating logical principles is to enhance our capacity for arriving at truth claims, true propositions. Arriving at true claims and true propositions. Because as rational creatures, we understand the fundamental importance of truth in our daily interactions with fellow human beings and with the world in general. So, we shall begin to examine truth, validity, and form and their interconnections in the next discussion.